Great. Everyone should see that now. I'm also going to turn on the live transcription. You can disable that on your end if that's distracting for you. So my name is Dr. Alicia Shadaman. I'm the director of our center here for nonprofit NGO studies at Northern Illinois University. I'm excited that so many of you are joining us today. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsor of the event, the DeKalb Public Library. Our center here at NIU is an interdisciplinary center. We're committed to teaching both the why and the how. So meaning we have programs and do research about why we need each other, civic engagement, activism, but also more practical knowledge and skills like fundraising and financial management and all those things. We offer an undergraduate degree program in nonprofit and NGO studies, a major, minor, and certificate, as well as a new undergraduate certificate in grant writing. Some housekeeping items. We did throw a poll up on the screen if you want to answer that about have you voted yet. And I'll also throw up a poll shortly, just kind of your background, where you're joining us from today. If you are here as an NIU student and participating in the Business Passport Program or Honors Engaged, I'll be posting that QR code at the end of the session, so you can snap that on your phone and check in. Later today, everyone who registered will receive an email with a link to the recording. The session is being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, where you can always go for all of our previous programs as well. So I'd like to welcome our presenter. Dr. Claire Dunning is an assistant professor in the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland, College Park, and an affiliated faculty member in the Do Good Institute and the History Department. Dr. Dunning is a historian of the United States in the 20th century, focusing on the histories of poverty, inequality, governance, and nonprofit organizations in American cities. She holds a PhD in history from Harvard University and a bachelor's degree in history and public policy from Dartmouth College. She was a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford University's Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society, and also previously worked at a community foundation. She's speaking today about her latest book called Nonprofit Neighborhoods. Welcome, Dr. Dunning. You can take it away.
Thank you so much. And thank you for this invitation and welcoming me into your virtual space, and on election day, no less. And exciting and important day. So as I reminded my students this morning, I'm going to share my screen. Here we are. Hopefully those popped up for you. So thank you again for that warm welcome. And as was said, my remarks are going to draw from my recently published book, Nonprofit Neighborhoods: An Urban History of Inequality and the American State. It's published by the University of Chicago Press. But before I get into the sort of details of the book itself, I want to contextualize this project in the larger questions that drive my research. There we are. I study whether nonprofit organizations and philanthropy can address racial and economic inequality, and do so through historical analysis of whether it has. So it's a forward-looking question about whether nonprofits and philanthropy can address racial and economic inequality. But because I'm a historian, I think that understanding what's happened in the past actually really matters, both for understanding our present and for helping us understand what kind of change might be possible or not. My research examines where and how inequality, nonprofit organizations, and policy intersect. And I tend to focus on cities as particular places of visible racial and economic inequality, and sites also of particularly innovative approaches to addressing it. And I'm interested in the structural relationships between these entities and how they developed over time. And I want to think about this sort of triangle as a product of history. There's nothing inevitable about these relationships. It was constructed by people in ways that we can understand in the present. There's nothing really inherently urban about the nonprofit sector, nor is it necessarily even a natural target of public policy or a partner to the state. And frankly, as I tell my students all the time, nonprofit organizations aren't even that interesting. It's just a line in the tax code that distinguishes the sort of subsector of organizations that carry a set of tax advantages. But as my research reveals, these entities started to come into closer orbit in the United States during the 20th century, particularly after World War II, following choices to increasingly funnel public and private resources, activism, and policy goals through nonprofit organizations as a strategy to address some of the nation's most pressing problems. And this coalescing quite consciously aligned with other mid-century trends, right? I'm thinking about the civil rights movement, the Cold War, cresting liberalism and then conservatism and deindustrialization. Put another way, the myriad roles that nonprofit entities play today in American society broadly, but particularly again in cities, right? There's an urban angle that I want to press on, have structural origins. And so given both the prominence and importance of these organizations and the persistence of pressing problems that people have been working on for decades, if not centuries, begs, at least for me, and I hope for you, questions about why we rely on private entities to pursue the public good, why we rely on small entities to address big challenges, and why we keep relying on strategies that so far have been inadequate. And so this is sort of my scholarly framing that, and it's a product of my academic training and my career, but the questions at the heart of my research actually come from my time working in philanthropy. So my first job out of college was working at a community foundation in Boston, where I was assisting a program officer on the housing and civic engagement and nonprofit capacity building dockets. And it was an incredible first job where I got to I had to schedule all the meetings, but I got to sit in and listen to them. It was amazing. And so one of the last meetings I attended before going to graduate school was this invite-only gathering of local funders, community leaders, and city representatives with my boss, right? I was there to take notes. And two elder statesmen of the Boston community, this man Mel King and Hubie Jones, had convened the meeting to present a study by a researcher at Tufts University, James Jennings, on the status of Boston's neighborhoods and its nonprofit sector. And Jennings shared a series of maps that have fascinated me ever since, and I actually write about them in the book. These are sort of really the specific origins of my book project. And first he designed this composite score, what he called a neighborhood distress score. And it blended social and economic indicators such as foreclosure rates and percentage of families in poverty. And you can sort of see that map here. So we're looking, this sort of spine, if you can see my cursor, is the most distressed area. Second, he mapped the racial and demographics of the city. So we're layering people on top of need and distress. And third, he mapped the locations of different nonprofit organizations, including health centers, community development centers, social service groups. And what he found largely was that the areas of highest distress were also home to the city's Black and Latinx populations and home to significant numbers of nonprofits. And so we can think about this co-location of need and nonprofits as signaling a number of different things, right? Maybe this is a story of success and nonprofits are actually identifying where need exists in the city. Maybe it means they're actually doing a very poor job of addressing needs and neighborhood distress. And so these maps could and did spur a lot of conversation at that meeting about where local leaders should go, what to do with this knowledge, about how to direct their nonprofits, some local funding, et cetera. But this sparked a sort of whole set of historical questions for me, that Jennings's maps reflected contemporary data, though this was sort of 2010 at the time, but the segregation that he pointed to and the organizations he highlighted were longstanding. Many of the groups were founded when Mel King and Hubie Jones, our two hosts for the day, right here they are as young men on the left. This is Hubie Jones and Mel King, at a Black Solidarity Day event in Roxbury, a neighborhood of Boston in 1968. Right, so these are long-standing organizations, and there was a temporal dimension to Jennings's findings. And so despite decades of efforts, these overall patterns of need persisted. And so my book specifically, and research agenda more broadly, reflect my continued wrestling with this set of questions about the ability of nonprofits to address inequality in American cities. And it grapples with the reality that instead of actually solving the biggest problems in our midst, we've just invented new ways of managing them. And so my findings should not be taken as a reason to demonize nonprofits or to undermine the important work that they do. on the contrary, right? So please don't take this as a dismissal of the work, but rather to recognize that the limitations of nonprofit organizations are a feature and not a bug of urban governance, and to root their inadequacy in broader and continuing patterns of racial exclusion. So I'm trying to zoom out and think not just about the limitations of organizations one-on-one, but what are the broader structures in which they inhabit? So the book has 7 chapters. It opens in the 1950s amid urban renewal and a growing sense of what some have called an urban crisis. And the book reframes post-war American history through a history of Boston. So this is a local study, which I argue both foreshadowed and reflected national trends. My focus on Boston had some pragmatic and methodological underpinnings. I was a graduate student at Harvard University, and so I could access a trove of archival records held at Northeastern University in Boston, which had amassed a really rich collection of nonprofit records. And so I paired these with local government repositories to shed light on how government money is connecting private local nonprofits with local governments. And you can see here as an example of how really central government grants, which ended up becoming really important to my research, were to the Roxbury Multi-Service Center. You can see here, for example, all these starred lines on their budget. These are all government grant programs that are helping keeping the Roxbury Multi-Service Center afloat in the mid and early 1970s, pictured here. So if we were to sort of look at my data, right? I'm a historian, so my data looks different than a lot of other social scientists. This is what my data looks like. It's a lot of paperwork, some of which is really boring, but can actually help us piece together stories about why people made decisions in the past and what the consequences have been. So I looked at correspondence, memoranda, funding application, newsletters, flyers, community posters. This is sort of what my data looks like. And so for the rest of my talk, I want to take you through one of the central arguments of the book. And I'm going to argue that the growing involvement of nonprofit organizations in urban governance became a primary tool to manage urban inequality. I'll show that it was encouraged by policy and it was politically popular among local bureaucrats, Black activists, and white corporate leaders. How the distribution of government grants to nonprofit-based organizations increased, decentralized, and diversified participation in urban governance. How this approach to governing was particularly employed as a means of managing Black demands for equality, such that over time, the privatizing governance practices of partnering local nonprofits with city government simultaneously expanded and contracted democratic participation to disproportionately shape Black neighborhoods in Boston, and how these tools have reinscribed new forms of inequality on American cities, raising, at least for me, concerns about what this system as a whole has reproduced and what it has sometimes purposefully avoided. There are other arguments in the book that perhaps we might talk about later. One on the reconsidering the American state, given its reliance on grant making. One on the rise of neoliberalism and how decisions by people who wouldn't necessarily identify as neoliberals nonetheless helped prop up that ideological vision. And one that spatially grounds the notion of the nonprofit industrial complex in urban areas. And so with all that preamble, let's dive in. Right, so Boston, like most American cities in the 1950s and early 1960s, faced a slew of challenges that scholars now group as the, quote, urban crisis. Observers initially used the term quite narrowly to refer to 1960s era uprising, but more recently, scholars have expanded the term both temporally and conceptually. We now recognize the urban crisis as a set of linked processes around deindustrialization, suburbanization, and white flight that reflected public policy choices and simultaneously increased need in urban neighborhoods and decreased the ability and willingness of municipalities to respond. The local version of this in Boston is embodied by the construction of Route 128. It's a highway. And it was known to some as, quote, the Golden Road, and to others as the Road to Segregation. And these nicknames, I think, really capture the public investment in Route 128 and the private wealth that grew around it through industry and housing as this new sort of highway around the suburban ring of Boston attracted both industry and families looking to relocate to the suburban edge. And these areas existed through mortgage financing, zoning, and other mechanisms of exclusion for white families predominantly. These are very white areas. And so this meant that Boston lost much of its tax base, contained a crumbling housing stock, and became characterized by deep municipal and regional segregation. So this map of Boston displays what some call the, quote, black boomerang of segregated census tracts, home to over 70% of Black Bostonians. The city and residents were becoming poorer in a vicious cycle, and that poverty carried a racial dimension. This is a pretty widespread and familiar story, hardly unique to Boston. Also familiar are the federal government's responses. Urban renewal during the 1950s and early 1960s targeted so-called slums with a combination of bulldozing and construction that had well-documented consequences of displacement, removal, and warehousing of poor people, particularly people of color. And early renewal efforts in Boston, most famously in the West End, pictured here, right, the complete bulldozing of an entire neighborhood, and in the more racially diverse New York streets, neighborhood of the South End, received significant pushback, but not early enough to prevent these projects from moving forward. But they did threaten future ones, right? The complete anger at what was happening in urban renewal raised a political problem that the newly elected Mayor John Collins, he'd run in 1960 for the mayoralty on a promise to, quote, plan with the people, instead of doing this sort of top-down imposition of urban renewal on neighborhoods. And he hired Ed Logue, pictured here, from New Haven as his renewal czar in a bid to really sort of reset this program of urban renewal. And so to manage local protest and comply with federal regulations requiring at least some sort of citizen participation, Logue and Collins decided to outsource the local participation requirement of renewal to community agencies. And really what began as a pragmatic experiment for the purposes of just urban renewal, this one federal program, became a standard mode of urban governance. And the Federal Housing and Home Finance Administration had encouraged this approach, urging municipalities to contract with local nonprofits since these agencies could, federal materials suggested, quote, play a key role in interpreting the program to neighborhood families with whom they had had long associations. It's this notion, right, that nonprofits seemed to carry a degree of trust and authenticity at a time when the government increasingly did not. And so Logue in Boston follows this tactic, extending nonprofit grants and contracts to promote renewal activities and manage participation on behalf of the city in areas such as Washington Park and Charlestown. This was particularly valuable, Logue soon learned, in winning the support of the Black community of Washington Park and responding to their initial anger at being excluded from the massive spending on urban renewal. And it's really easy to forget that before it became known as, quote, Negro removal, many Black residents in Boston saw renewal as a potentially good thing and an opportunity for federal spending in places long denied it. And so when initial plans for Boston excluded parts of Roxbury, right, the predominantly Black neighborhood in the city, Otto Snowden, co-founder with his wife Muriel of the nonprofit Freedom House, fired off a telegram to the mayor noting, we cannot understand this constant bypassing unless it is a matter of racial discrimination. Logue responded, give me a chance, inaugurating a new role for Freedom House as sort of this private space of public inclusion. Now, Freedom House had a long reputation as a leading civil rights organization in Roxbury, as well as for its commitments to principles of integration, middle-class uplift, and home ownership. And Logue, right, he's a shrewd man, and he'd kept these characteristics in mind when he extended a contract. And now, granted, the Boston Redevelopment Authority had signed similar contracts for nonprofits in other neighborhoods to manage relocation of families displaced by renewal. But the Freedom House one stood out as transferring far more responsibility, including for planning and ratifying neighborhood designs and managing aspects of implementation. It's a roughly $30,000 contract in the early 1960s, and this represented a significant influx of funds to the organization, enabling Freedom House to hire more staff, including 5 Black women from the community. Here we see Muriel Snowden hosting Logue, who's holding the ruler, Mayor Collins, who's seated, he was a wheelchair user, and other members of the Boston Redevelopment Authority in Roxbury. Excuse me. And Freedom House itself was transformed by the presence of giant maps to function as a public space that at extended hours of the day for residents to view plans, offer input, and contribute to the future design of the neighborhood. After soliciting input from neighbors at community meetings, right? So here are local folks showing up at a nonprofit, offering their opinions and redesigning their neighborhood, right? It's an incredible process that's unfolding. And Freedom House eventually delivers a positive vote, which unlocks federal funds for urban renewal in Washington Park, including for a new school, housing, and other community facilities. It's not always a smooth process. Neighborhood residents actually pushed back against the Boston Redevelopment Authority, and many of the new buildings never actually got built. But the process had produced the successful vote that Logue and Mayor Collins had needed, and nonprofit Freedom House had successfully amplified concerns of Black Bostonians to solicit and shape city plans for their neighborhood when few had avenues to do so. Quickly and loudly, Washington Park was heralded for its participatory approach to planning. And while the image of Freedom House's role as a vehicle for civic participation often exceeded its reality, renters in Washington Park, for example, had little recourse to combat plans that ultimately favored homeowners. The narrative it supported in academic journals, including this one, which is quite a fuzzy image, I apologize. And with national audiences, right? You see here attendees from the local American Society of Planning that came and toured Freedom House. It's the story that outsourcing participation to community groups to manage democratic processes of citizen participation, policy implementation, community representation, and information distribution was a really productive strategy of urban management. The city got to reap the rewards of appearing responsive while also abdicating responsibility for results and maintaining the power to actually select who the partner was. And so this pattern keeps continuing and becomes really a go-to strategy for later mayors and public leaders, particularly white mayors and leaders, looking to manage Black protest and Black neighborhoods. Consider a few high-profile examples. During one of Boston's most infamous episodes, the start of busing for school integration in 1974, Mayor Kevin White relied on a partnership with a neighborhood nonprofit to manage the start of the school year. Here you see a bus monitor from the nonprofit Citywide Educational Coalition training volunteer parents. Here's a bus escort on the right. This is a rumor control center at City Hall that maintained regular contact with neighborhood nonprofits such as Freedom House. Now, many of these partnerships were actually in place for several years before busing. Following a 1971 strike by Black students, the city allocated federal funds under the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, which is a law enforcement-oriented grant program, to the Roxbury Multi-Service Center to launch a crisis response program to, quote, prevent future disorder. And during the 1972-1973 school year, the Savmore Community Program helped manage the school dismissal process at the local middle school. These nonprofit staffers kept the calm far better than police officers, who often only served to escalate the situation with shotguns and dogs, which were brought in on more than one occasion. And so these activities aligned with the city's goal of preventing uprising, but fell fundamentally short from the nonprofit's perspective of actually addressing educational inequality in Boston, and continued to burden Black residents with maintaining safety, while it was often white teenagers and their parents initiating violence and threats. And the ability of neighborhood nonprofits to quickly mobilize in response to busing and to direct their longer-term capacities towards the crisis carried a flip side, right? Things quickly built could be quickly dissembled. And relying so heavily on existing grant relationships and organizations enabled the mayor's office to really de-escalate once the immediate crisis had passed. And by the third year of busing, when the biggest tests of the city's schools had passed, the citywide educational coalition, for example, lost its funding. They couldn't get their grant renewed. And when the nonprofit sought to address some of the, quote, real issues of educational reform, city grant managers encouraged them to seek private funding elsewhere. Managing the crisis meant surviving and not tackling deeper issues. Ooh. And so while I've highlighted two moments of crisis in which the city used government grant making to manage issues of racial and economic inequality, the majority of these tools were used in more quotidian ways that established patterns, precedents, and relationships which, at moments of crisis, both government and nonprofits fell back on. Under the Model Cities program in the 1960s and 1970s, the city used grants to meet the needs of growing populations of ethnic minorities. The city contracted with La Alianza Hispana, you see the mayor and founder Frida Garcia here, and the Chinese Progressive Association to provide translation services and culturally specific programs to populations whom the city considered, quote, problematic, which is to say the city itself might have actually provided translation materials or reformed their own operations to be more linguistically or culturally sensitive, but they instead relied on a nonprofit to do this on their behalf. And these kinds of arrangements really blanketed some neighborhoods. Funding for the South End is pictured here quite visually, right, to give a spatial dimension to these relationships. Each of these dots is a nonprofit, more or less, where different pots of government money is coming in to fund different projects in this neighborhood. And one of the things I really like to highlight about this approach, right, of government funding nonprofits to deliver goods and services is that they're doing it across a range of different issues and activities, right? They use it to provide social services, build housing, promote safety, improve health, clean up parks, care for children and the elderly, and solicit citizen participation. And this was both reflective of the range and at times really the flexibility of federal programs that often underwrote these grant partnerships at the local level, but also the overriding sense in City Hall that working with neighborhood nonprofits made for both good politics and good policy implementation during an era of declining municipal revenue and federal support for cities and retreating faith in government. Such assessments then reinforced the seeming preferability of managing urban crises through partnerships with nonprofit organizations in an ongoing cycle. Right, so there's something that's really politically preferable about this as a way of responding to issues, but something deeply inadequate as well. And so far I've privileged the government's perspective, why partnering with a nonprofit organization went from an experimental approach to managing urban renewal to a core feature of urban governance. But to fully understand this transformation and by extension its consequences requires looking at these arrangements from the perspective of nonprofit organizations and people involved in them, right? Because these are not handouts. They're responses to calls for equality and equity in the city by people traditionally excluded from it, and choices by those in power to supplement an unequal system with nonprofit services rather than address the structural underpinnings of that inequality. So for individual nonprofits, excuse me. All right, so for individual nonprofits, government grant programs offer a huge opportunity, at least theoretically, for revenue, for authority, for legitimacy, for capacity, and for a seat at the table, which, when taken together, enabled organizations to begin to meet the immediate and pressing needs of their community when the government couldn't or wouldn't. Let's consider a few examples. So government funding enabled nonprofits to hire staff that came from neighborhoods where services would be delivered and pursue projects that residents clamored for. Here are women applying for jobs at a Head Start school at Freedom House. Here's a building constructed by the Puerto Rican group incorporated as the Emergency Tenants Council with a combination of market rate loans, foundation subsidized loans, and government grants. This is, I love this image in the middle. It's their ballot, with photos of people being elected to their neighborhood nonprofit council. And here are some materials from an LGBTQ youth serving organization that won funding as part of an initiative called Healthy Boston. And so these are all examples of public-private partnerships in action. But these opportunities left nonprofits vulnerable to the whims of grant making. Government grants were often for exceedingly short periods of time. Note here a tutoring program approved in June, expected to be launched in August, and then completed by March, which, if you've ever run a program, is an incredibly unrealistic timeline, right? This is a really sort of problematic way of actually doing anything, particularly when we're talking about tutoring kids. And this is one of my favorite documents that I found. And it's just a short little letter, right? Today would be an email. The whole line says, "Dear Paul, we sure needed the money. Thanks much." And another beleaguered executive director wrote to a city bureaucrat after several years of budget cuts, pleading, "We've used ingenuity up. What's desperately needed is more money." So yes, neighborhood-based organizations delivered valuable services, but they did so under conditions of financial precarity and organizational vulnerability. So by design, grant making is a form of competition that gives choice to those with the resources and incentivizes those seeking them to adapt to funding goals, draft affordable budgets, and downplay political activism. This put nonprofit leaders in a really difficult position, which they fully realized, of both courting government funding and challenging government inaction on issues of poverty, racial exclusion, and rising inequality. The South End Community Security Program, for example, organized elderly escorts and mailbox monitors on days that welfare checks were delivered at a local housing development. A city grant manager, however, denied the program's request for a funding extension, given what she saw as, quote, extra programmatic activities by community patrols that, in addition to escorting elderly residents, also distributed surplus food items such as dried beans, macaroni, oats, evaporated milk. And so they're addressing food insecurity and doing so in this creative way. But whether he agreed to it or not, the director of the program fired William Shabazz, pictured here, from the patrol for doing what we might regard as really important work, but for fear of running the risk of the program not being refunded by the city grant manager and losing the $60,000 grant itself, which was cut down from their $90,000 request. And so I spend a lot of time in the book tracing both what these arrangements looked like over time and why they developed in such a way, and I've tried to give you a little bit of a sense of both so far. I want to close by considering the consequences of these decisions made by mayors and activists and nonprofit leaders. Boston today is, in the 21st century, really defined by significant racial and economic inequality, visualized here by some research from the Brookings institutions, which ranked unequal cities and metros, and Boston ranked in the top for both, and research from the Boston Federal Reserve on the racial wealth gap in Boston, which is significant. So what if we hold this inequality alongside the fact that Boston also has a very robust nonprofit sector? What if instead of considering these as as opposites, we recognize inequality in the nonprofit sector as sharing some admittedly uncomfortable origins? And so there's no denying that past efforts have improved the lives of many, but improving outcomes is not the same as eliminating causes. And that doesn't make the work of neighborhood nonprofits unimportant. It makes it inadequate. And it sets a goal higher than improving the odds of surviving, while also recognizing that survival cannot be guaranteed. Put more concretely, the nonprofit Tent City Corporation might have succeeded in constructing 203 units of affordable housing. But what do you do when over 2,000 people show up on the first day of signups in 1987? That doesn't make 203 units unimportant. It means that the need is much greater. And so over the 20th century, a diverse range of groups increasingly fought to have their needs acknowledged and met through government funding and nonprofit activity. Such efforts transformed a strategy to manage moments of immediate crisis into one to manage demands for housing, health, safety, services, education, training, employment for a wide range of constituencies. Different ethnic and linguistic groups, the young and the old, gay men, lesbian women, queer youth, those experiencing homelessness, those diagnosed with HIV/AIDS, single parents, gang-involved youth, etc. And so this is, on the one hand, a really remarkable feat of creating a governance regime that recognized the diversity of the American city, but it also reinforced the political and economic inequality of these groups by addressing those diverse needs through a private entity that, while closer to government, remained outside of it. And while nonprofit entities are deeply intertwined with the state and market, they've proven an inadequate counterweight against broader shifts in the political economy of American cities. And I want to be clear that I'm not the first to point out these tensions. Grassroots groups have been leveling similar concerns about both the importance and the inadequacy of nonprofit activities since the 1950s. But they've had reason to be careful in criticizing the public and private funders that keep them afloat. As a result, I see academic research, including this book project, as having some of the security and reputational authority with which to shine a light on this broader system of funding and power and partnerships that characterizes urban governance in the 21st century. So nonprofit organizations play a critical role in creating a more just society, but they've proven an inadequate counterweight against the broader shifts in the American political economy. And that is a political challenge and a policy one that must be addressed on a structural level and not just by adjustments to program models at the margins. As cities continue to face profound challenges, my work argues for an interrogation of the solutions that we've turned to for decades, an understanding of their origins in the past, and a grappling with their consequences in the present. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dunning. It's a lot, right? It's a lot. You're going to stop sharing? Yep.
Yeah, is that okay?
Yep. We had a couple of questions, and I guess to kind of kick us off is, you gave us a little bit about your background in Boston, but why do you think Boston in particular is just an interesting city to look at? And how do you think that translates to other American cities like Chicago, where we're close to?
Excuse me, thank you for that. Yeah, so Boston, on the one hand, is really on the sort of forefront of a lot of these early federal grant programs. It's regarded as a liberal city, though that reputation sort of is not always true to reality, as reputations only often are. It has really close ties to the Kennedy administration and the Johnson administration in the 1960s, and with research institutions like Harvard and some of the prominent hospitals, is really an early winner in a lot of these big federal grant programs. And so what's happening in Boston is sort of filtering up to shape some federal policy. And Boston's really looked to often as a sort of example for other cities to follow. So on the one hand, Boston's sort of on the leading edge for a variety of reasons. On the other hand, the programs that it's participating in are federal in origin. So Boston's competing against Chicago, Oakland, Austin, Seattle, and they're all doing their own version of these same kinds of federal programs that are funding local activities. So it is a national transformation and a national story here, though I think telling it at the local level enables us to see how like personality and local politics and the local sort of racial dynamics shape what are sort of patterns that are being replicated, each with their own sort of version. But this sort of pivot and inclusion of nonprofit organizations is a really national sort of federal strategy at the government level and happening in cities across the US.
So Maureen asked about private foundations, and you worked for a community foundation. So you have the understanding of the philanthropic section here as well. Do they have a role here in supporting what government is trying to do? And how has that changed over time, in your opinion?
Sure. Yeah, private foundations are playing a really important role here. Some of it is that they're quite consciously co-investing with the federal government. So in the 1960s, the War on Poverty, launched by the Johnson administration, the Ford Foundation is launching its Gray Areas Initiative. So they're similarly concerned with urban poverty and urban inequality. And they basically have some backroom conversations about like, we're both sort of interested in Boston, like we're going to pick a winner together and use our resources sort of combined. And so one of the things I look at is how that sort of both creates opportunities for nonprofits who have both government and philanthropic grants and sort of hems them in. The private foundation, the Ford Foundation dollars cover overhead in ways that public grants often don't. So there's some creative accounting, which isn't to say illegal, it's all perfectly legal, but the way that they're billing the public and private funders is really strategic. There are a number of local funders in Boston that play an important role, both in sort of launching nonprofit organizations and helping sustain them to help manage some of the inadequacies, right? Government grants are much more tightly narrowly scoped and defined, right, which makes sense from the government's perspective in terms of the stewardship of public resources. And local private foundations help mitigate some of that unevenness. At the same time, foundations, particularly those with staff members and others with a business background, they're pushing a lot of arguments around efficiency, data, metrics, that is coming from the foundation sector, really trying to sort of push, not always purposefully, but in sort of making nonprofits more business-like, more efficient. They're really fueling an anti-government narrative about the sort of preferability of solving problems through private efforts. There's ways in which this aligns with what nonprofits are looking for, but ultimately sort of undermines the larger investment in public good by promoting a particular version thereof and really sort of disciplining nonprofits around what's sort of regarded as political activity. So foundations do play a really important role here, but they are not without their own opinions and sort of strategies here around what a more equal city might look like. Foundations at the time and since continue to be predominantly white institutions. And so fueling a very particular version of what nonprofits could or should be doing.
Yeah, and I happen to be doing a webinar tomorrow on outcomes. So I loved your line, improving outcomes is not the same as eliminating causes. And when these funders, either government or private funders, are really pushing for impact and outcomes, and yet we know with such limited dollars, can nonprofits actually really push for changes to impact and outcomes when there's so many systemic causes underneath? And I think that's a huge challenge for nonprofits who want that funding, but they're like, what can we promise when we know the impact that really needs to happen is kind of beyond our scope and ability?
Absolutely, right. And one of the things that drove me nuts, I loved working in the foundation. It was one of the best educations I ever had. But we're talking about problems like structural inequality, and then we're looking at 3-year grant cycles, right? And I understand why we would want to like spread the money around and sort of encourage and incentivize creativity. But being a historian, right, one of the things I really emphasize is change is slow. Change happens both fast and slow, and to expect organizations to meet these standards of both proof and change in really short time horizons is a challenge and a problem, and it privileges certain kinds of strategies and certain kinds of organizations over time. So I write a little bit about a housing group and sort of an interest in creating loans instead of grants. But all this is to say is questions of justice start to sort of take a back seat to questions of efficiency, which isn't to say that there isn't a value in efficiency, but we're making a choice when we're talking about justice and need versus efficiency and outcomes. Those can sit together. They're not necessarily in tension, but we need to name the sort of choices that are being made by funders and sort of creating constraints on organizations who either have to sort of keep up with the Joneses, as it were, or lose their funding and the important work that they're doing.
I'm going to throw up a poll before I forget. And if you can indicate, you can answer multiple things, but your student, faculty member, researcher, nonprofit, or government employee, because I'm just curious about one, who's in the room, but also, you know, when we start to talk about this work, for nonprofits, it's really hard to do the service. We want to serve people. Oh, and we should be advocating to actually eliminate this problem at the same time. And you've got funding meshed in here. So kind of your point, you bring up some really good examples. You're a little bit risk averse to try to have those hard conversations because you're so afraid that funding will go away. And many human service organizations, when I've examined them over time, you know, 80 to 90% of their funding is now coming from government. And so it's a very political environment. Yeah, so I was just curious who's in the room, but any thoughts on that? How do you do advocacy work, true advocacy, where you're pushing for mission and really elimination of problems? Oh, and at the same time, we still want to be able to do service delivery.
I don't have a great answer other than that it's extraordinarily difficult. And one of the things that I'm trying to do with the book is to really push funders, both public and private, to recognize the environment that they're putting nonprofits in, right? And to recognize that funding advocacy, right, for all the reasons that we just talked about, things that can be measured, advocacy is hard to measure. Change looks slow until all of a sudden you actually pass legislation. And nonprofits are risk averse for understandable reasons when it thinks about what is or is not political, right? And of course, naming something as political is itself a political choice. And so we can sort of escalate ourselves, talk into these corners. But a recognition that, right, I think finding ways for nonprofits to be able to name, like, look, we can do this really well. But unless we deal with the actual sort of structural underpinnings, and dealing with structural underpinnings means talking about white supremacy, it means talking about anti-Black racism, it means talking about exclusion on a number of different axes. That's hard to do, but it's the only way that we're going to be able to move forward. And so what that actually looks like from a day-to-day level of nonprofit organizations, I don't have a great answer, I'm afraid, other than to just acknowledge that it's a tension, and that the more space that we can create from private foundations in particular to enable organizations to build some advocacy and policy chops and power, that's really important. Social movements have been our most effective vehicle for creating change in the United States, and it's the hardest thing to get funded.
Yeah. So while we have so many students on with us today, can you briefly talk about kind of your research process? How did you do this and the timeline? Because we have a finished book in our hands, but how long and what was your process on a very short version? I think students would be amazed sometimes at how much work goes into this. Yeah.
So let's see, the book came out this past summer. I started graduate school in 2010. And I started the project probably 2 years into my PhD. So it was a 10-year project to go from idea to actually, right, like holding my own physical book in my hands, right? It's an amazing feeling and also like a very surreal one. So what the research actually looks like. So as a historian, it means going to archives. And so the sort of documents that I showed you, those are in huge, big folders and files. And so sifting through, taking photographs of them, of ones that if I couldn't go back on a regular basis, but months of just reading like some really boring stuff of like reading budgets and annual reports and meeting minutes and trying to trace across, right? Like a year's worth of board of director minutes. Like, what are the issues coming up in January? Are they voting on them in June? Like, how are they talking and dealing with questions of like, should we take this government grant, or how do we deal with the need for affordable housing in our neighborhood, right? They're sort of asking questions and sending letters back and forth. And so I'm reading the letters back and forth, excuse me, around like how they're making choices and building personalities, right? I'm trying to sort of make and sort of build profiles of people in the past, right? They're real people. What was their personality like? And one of the things that I always find so funny is that it was very common on your resume to list your height and your weight, your marital status, and your social security number.
Really?
People would put their social security numbers on all of their resumes. So before we sort of think about like the most precious data you have about yourself and like your height and your weight, so there's lots of unobjective like problems with that, but nonetheless I'm trying to like understand these people and what motivates them, and so following them in newspapers and archival documents and
Awesome.
really slow.
I'm going to just share my screen because students need to check in. So let me just do that. So students, I'm going to put up the business passport one first. We can keep chatting. So I'm going to put up the business one first, and then I will put up the honors college. So if you are here from the business passport program, you can just snap that QR code. And then I will put up the next one, which is our honors engaged students. Okay, and there's our honors engaged. Thoughts on the faith community? That was a question that had come up in the chat.
I was just catching up on the chat. Definitely faith institutions are part of this. Some of them are running local nonprofits. Faith is certainly a motivation for a lot of folks involved in this work, even if it's not like a formal religious institution. I don't write a ton about religion, but it's certainly there. Religious groups are very much a part of this landscape, and certainly the faith-based initiatives out of various White Houses, the sort of charitable choice programs that enable local religious groups to compete for some of these federal grants is key. And there are a few local religious funders in Boston that were really sort of on the progressive end of things that helped prop up some local social movement organizing that was really important here in the story that I'm telling. I'm also catching up on Linda's note here in the chat about the sort of separation of advocacy and funding. And yeah, I think that those kinds of walls between the distribution of dollars and the policy making is really important. I don't know how realistic that could be, in part because I think they are already separated, but part of the problem is the sort of veneer of politics, or sort of the veneer of who pushes for what. But it's hard. Yeah. There needs to be more separation. And at the local level, it becomes even more complicated, where at the sort of within City Hall, when City Hall becomes a grant maker, first of all, it changes fundamentally what City Hall is doing when they start monitoring and going over all these local documents. There's some separation when we're talking about sort of when Washington is funding local nonprofit groups. It's a different sort of relationship than when it's mediated by cities and states.
So you mentioned, Dr. Downing, this was a 10-year project. What are things you're working on now, or things that have come out of this project? Maybe you're like, I'm done with this. This took 10 years of my life. Or what's some upcoming research things that you're working on?
So the next book project, so I'll see you again in 10 years.
Awesome.
Is I'm looking at the role of philanthropy in so this question about can and how do nonprofits push a policy agenda, right? One of my big criticisms is that there's this wall, is looking at philanthropy on the liberal left side of things that pushed changes in housing policy in particular after the passage of fair housing in 1968. So sort of after the culmination, after the achievement of racial equality under law in the 1960s, still persistent discrimination, and a small group of foundations started to push for major changes in the legal and policy code around housing. And so I'm looking at some foundation archives and following how they really changed the housing landscape. So both housing policy, but then how foundations change, like where people live, where they go to school, who their neighbors are, and to think about that as a philanthropic story, and one that's deeply intertwined with racial equality and inequality when these foundations are led predominantly by white men making decisions, right, on the one hand, quite supportive of racial equality, but it's still their perspective on what that looks like.
So we talked before the program got started, because I'm working on a little bit of a history project, but how rare is it that you're a historian by training, but you're also in like a public affairs school and public administration talking about these organizations? What can we learn from the past that will help us do a better job today?
So I think history helps us understand the root causes in different kinds of ways. So history helps us understand the predicament that we're in a different kind of way. It emphasizes to me that change is slow, that change happens in ways that we don't always anticipate. So again, pushing back against the 3-year time horizon, understanding the limitations of nonprofits, not as the failure of individual organizations, but situating the whole sector in patterns of racial exclusion. Like that's a historical narrative that helps us really sort of push back on this idea of let's just improve accounting practices. Like that's important, but there's something that's really inadequate about that I think we need to address far more substantively. And if we don't understand how we got to our present, there's no way we're going to be able to reshape our future. So to me, it's a diagnostic tool of understanding, why, like, how can we situate today's election in a much longer term trajectory of any number of different things. So history emphasizes context and consequences in ways that, to me, is the only way to look forward, right? We sort of run the risk of repeating long-term mistakes if we don't really grapple with how we got here. So sometimes I'm intellectually lonely, but I have a lot of colleagues who I keep insisting that the past matters, and like actually,
Absolutely.
we can't look forward if we don't look back.
Thank you. So here's the QR codes again for students. I also want to remind folks, we have a couple of upcoming programs that you might be interested in. One, we're going to talk about CRMs and nonprofits with a representative who has his background in Salesforce. He's actually an econ major of ours, an alum. That's coming up on November 18th. And then we're going to jump to another discipline and talk about psychology of fundraising with Jen Shang, who got a PhD at Indiana University, and tries to bring those disciplines together to help us with our understanding. So I want to thank Dr. Dunning again for her participation today. The book is awesome. Pick it up if you can. It will be here in our NIU library. We'll take our copy and make sure that it's over there. I know that the DeKalb Public Library probably purchased it for theirs as well. So I just want to really thank you, Claire, again for joining us this afternoon and for a great discussion.
Thank you for having me and for a great chat afterwards. It's really been delightful.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. See you soon.